right, Taylor, we got about 100 people on if you want to we want to get rolling. So good morning, everybody. I'm Sarah Rain. I'm the CEO of HCAR. Thank you so much for being here today. And we are very fortunate to have Taylor Kitzmiller, who is an attorney with Maryland REALTORS, here to talk to y'all about what is going to be changing with the statewide forms on August 14th. Due to the requirements of the NAR settlement. So what we're going to do, I'm going to keep everybody muted while, just so that Taylor can get through his presentation. And then after that, if you'll raise your hand when you have a question, we will start answering questions for you. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Taylor.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. As Sarah said, we're preparing for that August 14th date when all of these changes that we'll go over today will go into effect. And so just some things to note. All these forms that we're going over today are educational versions currently. They are available on our website for you all to see. We've also sent them out through emails. Also on our website, you will find a video series of us explaining the changes. So myself and my colleague Diamond Smith, we go over all the changes that we made to our forms that I will go over today. So that's a great resource. Also, we did a broker webinar probably 3 weeks ago where we went over some of the changes. That is available on our YouTube page at Maryland REALTORS YouTube page. It's about 2.5 hours long, I think. But we got asked a bunch of questions. So that's a great resource as well. Also, you can all mark your calendars. I don't believe we sent out an email yet, but we definitely will be. We will have a webinar open to all members next Thursday at 10 a.m., which I believe is August 1st. Yeah, I believe that is August 1st, 10 a.m. We'll have that webinar, and basically I'll do exactly what I'm doing today, and people are free to ask questions at that webinar as well. Not only have we released these educational versions of the forms, we've also just released late last week, I think on Thursday, amendments to our current brokerage agreements. So the question we've been asked a lot is, what if I have a brokerage agreement with my client today, but then August 14th rolls around? Do I have to terminate that and have them sign the brand new one? What do I do? So we provided you with amendments to our current brokerage agreements. So now let's say I represent a seller today. I can have my seller sign that amendment, and all of the amendments will amend your current brokerage agreement. And those amendments will go into effect on August 14th. So if your client signs that, August 14th rolls around, you still haven't closed. Even if you're under contract, if you have not closed yet, if you're still representing that client come August 14th, they need to sign that amendment, because on August 14th, you must be in compliance with the terms of the settlement agreement. So those are available now for use. I would recommend, getting your clients to sign them earlier rather than later, so you're not pushing it to that August 14th deadline. Okay, I'll share my screen here and we'll get started. Oh no, don't hide the video panel. Show video panel. Sorry, you would think I would be on top of Zoom by now. There we go. Okay. So we will start out with our exclusive buyer-tenant residential brokerage agreement. The only changes we have made to this agreement come in paragraph 8, which is the compensation section of the buyer brokerage agreement. First change we made was specifically required by the settlement agreement. We've added 2 sentences to the broker compensation notice that state each real estate brokerage independently sets their own commission rates, and commission rates are negotiable between the buyer and their broker. Specifically, that last sentence was required to be put into all brokerage agreements required by the settlement agreement. The next change we made was somewhat major. So currently, our brokerage agreements for this section, where compensation to be paid by buyer, where the buyer is agreeing to compensate their broker, currently it is just a blank paragraph. However, at this last legislative session, a new law was passed to require brokerage agreements in Maryland to state compensation in one of three ways. It has to be percent of the sales price and a dollar amount, or it could just be a dollar amount. So we've replaced that blank paragraph. And now when you're sitting down with your clients, and you'll see the same change was made to the listing agreement. Now when you're sitting down with your clients, you're going to have them choose one of these options. We've also added in here, so compensation to be paid by buyer, subject to paragraph 8B, in the event of a sale or lease, the compensation to be paid by buyer to broker shall be whatever the parties agree to here. So clearly stating to the buyer, you are agreeing to pay me, your broker, this amount, subject to paragraph 8B. So that might not be the case, depending on what happens and what is explained in paragraph 8B. So we'll scroll down to paragraph 8B here. And before I get into the specific changes, one of the main goals of all the changes that we made was to ensure that our brokerage agreements were put in plain language. Because we want somebody who's a first-time home buyer, first-time home seller, doesn't know anything about real estate. They can read these changes specifically to the compensation paragraph, and they fully understand them. So they fully understand, specifically for a buyer, I've agreed to pay my broker X up here. And down here, these are all the scenarios where, I might not have to pay my broker, depending on what happens in the transaction. Just another thing to note. I know we're holding questions for the time being, but because we are among competitors, we cannot talk about specific compensation amounts. So nobody can say, a certain percentage that you charge your clients, it's going to be an antitrust violation. So if you're going to talk about percentages or dollar amounts, just say X% or X dollar amount. Okay, so let's get into the specific changes here. So property listed in the MLS. Compensation may be offered from the listing broker to broker through an offer of cooperative compensation. Broker shall attempt to secure an agreement for the amount of offered compensation from the listing broker prior to submitting an offer to purchase. So it's saying, buyer agent, buyer broker, before my buyer submits an offer on the property, it is your duty to attempt to secure an agreement for the amount of cooperative compensation. And we have created a new agreement form to do exactly that. The amount of compensation received by broker from a listing broker shall be credited against the compensation that buyer has agreed to pay broker in paragraph 8A of this agreement. So saying, buyer, if you agreed to pay me X% up here and the offer of cooperative compensation is Y%, then that's going to offset. And if it's lower, you're only going to be responsible for covering that difference. Except as provided below, if the compensation offered by listing broker to broker is less than the compensation buyer has agreed to pay broker in paragraph 8A, that above paragraph, buyer shall be obligated to pay the difference, which is exactly what I just said. If the amount of compensation offered by the listing broker to broker is equal to or greater than the compensation buyer agreed to pay broker in that above paragraph, buyer will not have to pay the compensation specified in that above paragraph. Basically saying, buyer, if you agreed to pay me X% and the offer of cooperative compensation is equal to that at Y% or greater, buyer, you're not going to have to pay me, your broker, anything. However, this is a pretty major change that's caused by the settlement agreement in this next sentence. broker is prohibited from receiving compensation from any source exceeding the compensation amount specified in paragraph 8A above. This is a complete 180 from what's currently in our brokerage agreements. Currently, our brokerage agreements say if the offer of cooperative compensation is greater than whatever the buyer agreed to compensate me, I, the buyer broker, get to receive that excess amount. The settlement agreement specifically states exactly what's in this sentence. The broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of what their brokerage agreement states, whatever they agreed to with their client, which is a 180 from how it has been in the past. Now, our job, well, I guess first, one of the most common questions we get is, if I'm a buyer broker and my client agrees to compensate me X%, and they submit an offer on a property and that property is offering greater than X% in cooperative compensation. The question we get is, can we amend our brokerage agreement and increase the compensation so I, the broker, can accept that extra amount? And this is what I can tell you. Our job as attorneys for Maryland Realtors is to explain to you all what the settlement agreement states. In which it states what I exactly just said. You know, it states broker is prohibited from receiving any compensation in excess of whatever they agreed to with their client. So that is what the brokerage agreement states. Whether or not you want to make it your brokerage's policy that, yes, you do amend that amount up, is your brokerage's call. And your broker should reach out to the brokerage's attorney, get their attorney's opinion on it, whether or not they think that complies with the settlement agreement or not, and then, you know, make that policy decision. So we, as Maryland Realtors, and you might have seen, you know, in the past couple of weeks, we've had a different stance on it. But moving forward, that's our stance. We explained to you all what the settlement agreement says. If you want to, you know, play around with possibly changing your policies to, I'm not going to say get around it, but if your brokerage's attorney advises you and says, you know, yes, our brokerage is going to allow our agents to amend that amount, or no, they aren't, that's your brokerage's call. Okay, moving forward. The amount of any such payment made by listing broker shall be with the seller's and buyer's prior knowledge and consent, and shall in no way okay, now I'm unmuted. And shall in no way affect the obligation of the broker to act on behalf of the buyer in the transaction. If the compensation offered by the listing broker to broker is less than the compensation buyer has agreed to pay broker in that above paragraph, buyer may include in the offer to purchase a request that the seller compensate broker in an amount equal to the difference between compensation in paragraph 8A and the amount offered by the listing broker. So that's referencing a new addendum to our contract of sale, which I will touch on in a second. But that situation is buyer has agreed to compensate buyer broker X%. Listing broker's offer of cooperative compensation is less at Y%. And the buyer has the option when they submit their offer to request that the seller compensate the buyer's broker the amount of that difference. And if the seller agrees and matches it, then the buyer doesn't have to pay the broker anything. And we'll touch on that amendment in a second. Property not listed in the MLS, this language is, I'm pretty sure, almost exactly the same as it is currently in our brokerage agreement. On property not listed in the MLS, broker shall disclose to the seller at first contact that broker represents buyer and shall provide written confirmation of the disclosure to the seller not later than execution of any purchase or lease agreement. Broker shall make any request for compensation from the seller at first contact. And finally, we've added in an initial section here for the buyer to acknowledge that they have read and understand the provisions of the compensation paragraph. Okay. Now we will go over that addendum that I just referenced. So the new addendum is called Buyer Request for Seller's Compensation of Buyer's Broker Addendum. First section here is where the parties state what the current offer, current agreement for cooperative compensation is. So prior to the execution of this addendum, listing broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker an offer of cooperative compensation in the amount of X, whatever that agreement is. That is the broker-to-broker compensation. So at the example we were going over, buyer has agreed to pay their broker X%, and in the paragraph 1 is what the offer of cooperative compensation is, less than X%. That's what you would state in paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 is where the buyer is requesting the seller to cover that difference. So in addition to any broker-to-broker compensation, the seller hereby agrees to pay buyer's broker the amount of X. So whatever that difference is what the buyer is requesting here. Important paragraphs, paragraph 4, seller hereby authorizes the settlement agent to pay buyer's broker whatever X% is or X dollar amount, which is the sum of paragraph 1 and 2 above. The next important paragraph, really the only other one, is 6, which states lenders may specify limits on how much a seller or broker can contribute to the buyer to pay for services traditionally paid by the buyer. These payments are called interested party contributions, or IPCs. The reason why that's important is because lenders set caps, IPC caps, how much a seller can contribute to a buyer for services that are traditionally paid for by the buyer. But because offers of cooperative compensation are traditionally paid for by a seller or seller's broker, so not traditionally paid for by the buyer, it is the intent of the parties that the amount in paragraph 4 should not be treated as an IPC. So lenders have come out and said, as of right now, they are not treating compensation of the buyer's broker as an IPC. Therefore, whatever that amount is not going to count towards that buyer's IPC cap. So we've added this in here essentially as kind of a heads up to lenders that, hey, lender, whatever amount the seller and listing broker have agreed to compensate the buyer's broker here should not be treated as an IPC and should not count towards that buyer's IPC cap. Okay. Okay, exclusive right to sell. Actually, before I move on to exclusive right to sell, one question we get pretty often is sub-agency still allowed in Maryland after August 14th? The answer is yes. Sub-agency is still going to remain an option, just as it is today. But then we get the ask question, I thought we had to have a written brokerage agreement with a potential buyer before we show them a property. NAR has come out and said that getting the understanding whom agents represent form signed by the buyer satisfies that requirement. So the recommendation always is to try to get that potential buyer to sign a buyer brokerage agreement with your brokerage. If they're, there's a way to make it more appealing. If they're uncomfortable with committing to a long-term agreement, you could have that brokerage agreement last for a day, as an example, to hopefully make that potential buyer more willing to sign that buyer brokerage agreement with your brokerage. However, if they refuse to sign it, you still have the option of being a sub-agent by having them sign the understanding whom form. So that's still an option as it is today. Okay. Exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement. We have more changes in here, mainly because Bright has updated some of their policies, which has caused us to update our listing agreement. However, the first change is not because of Bright. It is really just a language preference on our part. So previously, we referred to the duration of the listing agreement here as the listing term. We've now removed that term and replaced it with agreement term. So you'll see, listing term here, strike through, it's agreement term now, and the same down here, it's the same change. So not a substantive change at all there. The next changes that we'll go over were made because of Bright policy changes, Bright MLS policy changes. The first one, Bright has created a new form called right here, the MLS disclosures and residential seller / landlord options form. Essentially what this form is, it requires the seller and listing broker to state what date the property will be submitted to the MLS, number one, and number two, what status that property will be entered as, active, coming soon, or office exclusive. Another requirement of that rule is that agreement, that form, has to be signed at the same time as the listing agreement. So we've added in here kind of a heads up. Upon the execution of this agreement, seller and broker shall establish the date and status upon which the property will be entered into the MLS by executing that new form. The next change really isn't a substantive change at all. It was a change made because Bright changed their wording. But my understanding is just because they changed the wording here doesn't change the actual rules surrounding office exclusives. So previously, Bright said seller may elect not to have the property listing displayed on the MLS at all. They've now removed the word displayed and replaced it with distributed on the MLS at all. Like I said, I don't think this changes the rule, but we wanted to make our language match Bright's language, just for, it makes everything more simple if our language mirrors whatever Bright's language is. So it's no longer displayed, it's distributed, and those are, similar changes throughout here. Also, it used to state broker may not submit and market the property by and through distribution on the MLS, but you still have to submit the property to the MLS. It's just not going to be distributed on the MLS. So we removed that reference submit. You still have to submit it. Next change was to the coming soon paragraph. Previously, Bright's rule on coming soons was the listing agent had to enter an expected on market date for that property. That could be no later than 21 days from when the property was submitted to the MLS.
Yes,
Bright has now removed that 21-day restriction.
I'm just telling you that it's a side table.
Can you mute? I just muted them.
Everyone, please mute yourselves.
Okay. So we've removed that reference to the 21-day restriction. My understanding now is you can submit a listing as coming soon, and it can stay as coming soon for as long as that seller wants. Also, the rule used to be properties listed under the coming soon status may not be shown. That's still true. But it used to be and are not syndicated to public real estate websites. That is no longer the case. So now if you submit a property as coming soon on the MLS can provide that to other real estate websites, like Zillow, for example. Okay. This is the final change caused by Bright, and this is a new field that Bright has added to the MLS for seller concessions. The wording you hear, the way this is set up, is exactly how it appears on the MLS. And what this new field is it allows the seller the option to notify potential buyers that the seller is willing to consider requests for seller concessions. Two main things to note about this new field. First, it is optional, meaning the seller doesn't have to check yes or no, doesn't have to fill in this field at all if they don't want to. Two, it is non-binding upon the seller. So right now, as an example, I hope you all know that if a listing broker puts a listing on the MLS and states their offer of cooperative compensation, that is binding on the listing broker, meaning they have to pay that amount if a buyer broker brings a buyer who purchases the property. It's binding. This field is not binding on the seller. In other words, and I'll explain a little more in detail, but in other words, if the seller says, yes, I will consider requests for payments towards closing costs, and if the seller states a specific amount that they're willing to consider, X percent here, they're not bound to that. So as an example, remember, this is just an example. If the seller says, yes, I will consider requests towards payments for payments towards closing costs, and down here, the seller says they're willing to consider closing cost payments or concessions up to 10%. If the buyer sees that, submits an offer on the property requesting 10% of seller concessions, seller has the freedom to say no, because this is not binding on the seller. This really doesn't have a backbone, I guess you could say. Really, this is just providing potential buyers an indication whether or not the seller is willing to consider a concession. Other questions we get here. The definition of seller concessions includes amounts paid towards the buyer's service providers, buyer's broker. And the question we get is, well, I thought we couldn't state, buyer broker compensation on the MLS. The settlement agreement specifically says you can't have an offer of cooperative compensation on the MLS, number one. But it says the seller has the freedom to offer seller concessions on the MLS that can be used, if the buyer wants to, that can be used to compensate the buyer's broker. But what the seller can't do is say, I will provide you, buyer, with a seller concession, but you must use that to compensate your broker. Because essentially, at that point, it's an offer of cooperative compensation. So here, the seller's just saying, hey, buyer broker, I'm willing to consider requests for seller concessions. I can say up to a certain percentage if I want. And in the contract, if I agree to that and provide you with those seller concessions, you're free, buyer, to use it however you please. Okay, so let's get into actually filling out this section. So again, it's optional. Seller doesn't have to fill in anything if they don't want to. But if they do, they can say, no, I'm not going to consider requests for closing costs. They can say, yes, they will, and just leave it at that. Or they can say, yes, I will consider requests. And they have the option down here to state a certain percentage or certain dollar amount if they want to. Now, the main thing to remember here with this new paragraph, you always have to have your seller initial that they've read and understand this paragraph, regardless if they leave it blank. Because remember, it's optional, so they could leave this blank, but you always have to get their initial down here, regardless if they fill it out or not. Okay, the changes you see here mirror the exact changes we made to the buyer brokerage agreement. Added in, commissions are negotiable between the seller and broker. Have also replaced that blank compensation paragraph with these three options: percent of sales price in the dollar amount, or a dollar amount. So those are the same as the buyer brokerage agreement. Okay, Next change was to the previously authority to cooperate with other brokers. Now it is authority to cooperate with and compensate other brokers paragraph. The changes here really aren't substantive. They're more so language preference changes. It used to be broker shall be entitled to cooperate with other brokers. It's kind of soft language, so we've added broker is authorized to cooperate with other brokers as subagents or brokers retained by prospective buyers. Also, we used to reference, cooperation and compensation between buyer agents. That's not technically accurate. Cooperation and compensation is between brokers, not between agents. So now it's buyer brokers. Also, as I said before, we're trying to make these forms as easily understandable to a average person as possible. And the average person doesn't understand what cooperation means between brokers. So we've added in the definition here. Cooperate means sharing information on the property and making the property available to other brokers for showing to prospective purchasers. Last change we made, we referenced, we used to reference it as fee sharing between subagents and between the listing broker and subagents and buyer brokers. The correct term is compensation of subagents or buyer brokers. So we've replaced fee sharing with compensation. The other question we get is how these two paragraphs work. This paragraph and the overall compensation of the listing broker. It works exactly as it currently does. So up here, this is the total amount of compensation that the seller is agreeing to compensate their broker, the listing broker. And down here, the seller has the option, if they want to authorize that listing broker to share a portion of that total percentage or total dollar amount up here with a buyer broker or subagent. So up here, you have your full percentage up here, and then down here, if the seller wants to, they can authorize the listing broker to share a certain percentage of that with buyer brokers or subagents. The final change we've made was adding in this sentence here. Seller understands that compensating subagents or buyer brokers is optional. Just making it very clear to the seller that you are not required to offer cooperative compensation if you do not want to. And also we have the initial section here as well. Okay. Two more forms to get to here. Okay. Okay, as I referenced earlier, we now have a form for brokers to come to an agreement on the amount of cooperative compensation. So the main question that we get is, with offers of cooperative compensation being removed from the MLS, how are agents going to come to that agreement? Or brokers, really. How are brokers going to come to that agreement? They're going to use this form. Some things to note about the settlement agreement as it pertains to cooperative compensation. Offers of cooperative compensation cannot be listed on the MLS. You cannot advertise compensation for cooperative compensation at all on the MLS. As you'll see here at the top, this form shall not be uploaded to the MLS. NAR has actually just come out and said, however, in the agent remarks, the agent can put a link to presumably their broker's website or maybe their personal agent website. They can put a link in the remarks and say, you can find details about the property here. And presumably that whoever sees it can go to that link. And on that website, the listing broker can advertise the offer of cooperative compensation. What you can't do is say in the remarks anything about compensation. So you can't say, if you want to see my offer of cooperative compensation, go to this link. Just The guidance is you cannot say that, but you can say, if you want to find more details about the property, you can follow this link. So we've established can't talk about compensation on the MLS. You also cannot put any offers of cooperative compensation on any platform that takes a data feed from the MLS. So the only exception that was spelled out in the settlement agreement is you can state it on a broker's website. That's fine. If that broker's website takes a data feed from the MLS, broker can advertise cooperative compensation on their listings. But if you are any other platform, Showing Time, Zillow, any platform that takes a data feed from the MLS, you cannot state offers of cooperative compensation. So this form, like I said, this is the agreement between brokers for the amount of cooperative compensation. So we'll go through it line by line. Also, sorry, I want to add on to that. So those are the restrictions. Can't be on the MLS, can't be on anything that takes a data feed from the MLS. Outside of that, agents are free to advertise it anywhere else. So you can advertise it on social media, on your signs, at your open house, anywhere except for the MLS or something that takes a data feed, you're free to advertise your offer of cooperative compensation. Okay. This agreement serves as confirmation of the cooperative compensation offered by listing broker to buyer brokers or subagents in relation to the sale of the property noted above. The listing broker shall pay the cooperative compensation to a buyer broker or subagent who completes performance specified herein. Seller acknowledges that the offer of cooperative compensation is fully negotiable and not fixed by law or established by any membership organization with which listing broker is affiliated. Okay, now we'll get into the meat of the agreement here. Paragraph 1, in the event of a sale or exchange of the property above is made to a buyer produced or assisted by a buyer broker or subagent, seller has authorized listing broker to pay cooperative compensation to the buyer broker or subagent. Paragraph 2 and 3 is where you state where the brokers agree to the amount of compensation. So first, listing broker shall pay cooperative compensation to the buyer broker in the amount of X. Or listing broker shall pay cooperative compensation to the subagent in the amount of X. So, in practice, how this form is going to be used, it might change. But right now, how we envision it being used is, we'll take the example, I represent a buyer. I'm the buyer's agent. I see a property that my buyer's interested in. I can either call up the listing agent or broker and ask what the offer of cooperative compensation is. I see it on their brokerage's website. I see it on a sign, their social media. But I try to figure out first what the offer of cooperative compensation is. And then once I figure that out, remember, settlement agreement states buyer broker can only receive compensation up to the amount that they've agreed to with their client. So X%, let's say. So I, the buyer's agent or broker, can fill in X% here and send this to that listing agent or listing broker and say, my buyer's interested in this property. This is the amount of cooperative compensation that I would like to receive. And if that listing broker has been authorized to provide up to that amount of cooperative compensation, then they would sign off and agree and send it back to that buyer agent. And at that point, we have an agreement for cooperative compensation. If my buyer submits an offer on that property and it's accepted and it goes to closing, I have earned my cooperative compensation. Or let's say I put in X% here and the seller has authorized their listing broker to offer less than this amount, less than X%. Then the listing broker is not going to sign off on that. They're going to amend the amount and input whatever their seller has authorized them to offer in cooperative compensation. And then they would send it back to the buyer broker, who would presumably sign off on that. And then at that point, the buyer and the buyer broker know for this property, they're offering less than whatever amount the buyer has agreed to compensate the buyer's broker. We know they're offering less. And now my buyer can make a decision. They can, knowing that currently, the way the situation is currently, if I submit an offer and I don't request anything special, if I just submit an offer, it's accepted, and I purchase that property, I, the buyer, am going to be responsible for that difference. Or we know the offer of cooperative compensation is less. The buyer knows that they have that new addendum where they can request, okay, I'm going to submit my offer. I'm going to request the seller to compensate my broker in the amount of that difference. If they agree, great. I, the buyer, don't have to pay my broker anything. If they don't agree, then, well, I have to make a decision. Do I want to move forward and have to pay my broker? Or do I want to, withdraw my offer and move on to a different property? So that is the main portion of this, where whatever amount is stated in here that the brokers agree to, that is their agreement to cooperative compensation. Any other important paragraphs here? Not really. I mean, paragraph 6, the cooperative compensation earned by the buyer, broker, or subagent shall be paid at settlement from the proceeds of the transaction as it is today. Things to note about the signatures. This is an agreement between brokers. This is not a part of the contract of sale, just as offers of cooperative compensation currently are not a part of the contract of sale. They're agreement between brokers. However, we've added in the buyer's signature, mainly for transparency purposes. One of the claims in the settlement agreement was buyers were kept in the dark when it came to offers of cooperative compensation. So we want to be very transparent and include buyers so buyers can sign off and they understand for this property, the offer of cooperative compensation, the agreement is X% or X dollar amount. And then from then on, they can make an informed decision. Based on that, do I want to submit an offer or not? We've also added in the seller's signature. So the seller can confirm that their broker is offering an amount of cooperative compensation that they have authorized. In other words, if they have authorized their broker to offer X% and a buyer broker requests X%, then their broker should be agreeing to that because that's what they authorized. And if there was a situation where, they only authorized their broker to offer X%, but the buyer broker requests Y%, and the listing broker agrees to that amount, that is not okay, obviously, because the seller did not authorize their broker to offer that up to that amount of compensation. So that's why we have the seller's signature in here as well. Okay, the last change we've made is to an existing form. This is our seller contribution addendum, existing form. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. This is where the seller can agree to contribute to the buyer's closing costs. The change we made kind of goes back to that conversation about interested party contributions or IPCs. As we said before, compensating the buyer's broker, whether it's the seller or the listing broker, is not going to be treated as an IPC. So we've added in this disclaimer here. The parties shall use this seller contribution addendum to reflect seller's agreement to contribute to buyer's closing costs that are not related to the compensation of buyer's broker. The parties acknowledge that any agreement by the seller or seller's broker to compensate buyer's broker must be made through either the buyer request for seller's compensation of buyer's broker addendum, that first addendum that we looked at, and or the listing broker's offer of cooperative compensation agreement. So this is a heads up, basically, heads up to the agents, heads up to the parties. If there's an agreement to compensate the buyer's broker, that amount should not be included in here. Because if the parties just lump that amount in here, the lender is not going to know what's an IPC and what's not. So they're just going to treat whatever amounts in here as an IPC, and it's going to be counted towards that buyer's IPC cap. So buyer wants as much access to that cap as possible. So if there is any agreement to compensate the buyer's broker, do not include that amount in here. Include it in one of those two other places. The only thing you're including in here is the seller's agreement to contribute to the buyer's closing costs that are not related to compensating the buyer's broker. Okay. Let me actually pull up one more thing. So I'll pull up, I'm just going to show one of our amendments real quick. So like I said, our amendments are currently published. They are ready for use. And this is what they...
Reached the voicemail box of J.D. Titleman with Main Street Home Loans. Please leave your name, your phone number.
Okay. As you see at the top, the purpose of this amendment is to modify certain terms and provisions of the buyer agreement. The modified terms and conditions of the amendment shall go into effect on August 14th at 12:01 a.m. So, and we also have an amendment key here. So any highlighted language that you see down below is new language that's added to the buyer agreement. And any language that's stricken through with a red line is language that's going to be removed from the buyer agreement. We've had the question from a lot of members saying, when are you going to send the official version of the amendments? Because this is just a red line version. Not correct. This is the brokerage agreement amendment. This is the version you're going to have your client sign. We purposely added highlights and strike throughs to note what changes are being made to the brokerage agreements. Okay. So that's all the changes we've made. Let's go through some questions. Oh, whoops, sorry. Can you make the forms larger? Sorry. So we can have this form at open house. So I believe that is asking about the listing broker's offer of cooperative compensation. Yes, you can have that form at an open house. Remember, only restriction is offers of compensation, cooperative compensation can't be on the MLS or a platform that takes the data feed from the MLS. Is that the point at which the buyer can renegotiate the compensation they agreed to with the buyer agent / broker? So Robin, if you could unmute yourself and maybe expand upon that question a little more.
Hi, Taylor. I'm referring back to the previous section that you did before you got to the last section. At the end, you said these are the forms that you can negotiate the amounts. So my question was, and I know you said earlier in the presentation that it will be up to your broker whether or not you could adjust your compensations. But if your broker does agree to adjusting the compensations, because I'm assuming that some of them are going to have to be adjusted down, or sellers or buyers will not be able to afford to buy a home if the seller's not cooperating, and some will possibly be adjusted up if the seller agrees. So my question is, those two forms that you used that were together, and I can't see the names of them, so unfortunately, that was what my question was relating to. Before these get signed, or are these part of the negotiation for those agreements to adjust the compensation?
Well, so it really depends on what your broker's policy is going to be moving forward. But let's say the listing broker has been authorized to offer X% of compensation. I'm the buyer's broker. My agreement with my buyer says my buyer is going to compensate me Y%, which is less. When I submit this offer or submit this agreement to the listing broker, I'm going to put in Y%, because that's what my buyer has agreed to compensate me. In the settlement agreement states that's the maximum amount that I can be compensated. Now, if the parties agree, it becomes tricky, because if the parties agree to compensate that buyer broker more than Y%, up to the X%, whatever the listing broker has been authorized to provide, the buyer and the buyer broker have to amend, again, if the buyer broker's policy allows for this, would have to amend their buyer brokerage agreement to increase the amount of compensation. And if that amendment is agreed to and they do increase the amount of compensation, then that buyer broker is free to accept that amount. But if that buyer broker's policy is not to allow their brokers to amend the compensation amount upwards, then that buyer broker can only accept up to the amount that the buyer broker has agreed to.
Okay, that helps. And I guess the assumption is the brokers will only allow the compensation to be negotiated downward in order to solidify a deal.
So, yes. So you're touching on another point that we are not going to provide advice on. And that point is, we've been asked a couple times, okay, I'm a buyer broker. I have my buyer brokerage agreement with my buyer saying, in that paragraph, buyer, you agreed to compensate me X%. Can we add a provision in our buyer brokerage agreement that says, well, buyer, if the offer of cooperative compensation is less than that amount, then we won't charge you that amount. We will just charge you whatever amount of cooperative compensation is offered by the listing broker. And why that becomes tricky is the settlement agreement specifically states the amount of compensation that a buyer and their broker agree to has to be objectively ascertainable, number one, and number two, cannot be open-ended. And there's an argument, we're not taking a stance on this, but there's an argument to be made by including a provision like that. The amount of compensation is open-ended, because yes, the buyer agreed to a certain percentage up here, but this provision down here is saying that might not be the case, and it might be less, which would be open-ended. I mean, depending upon how you look at it, that could be interpreted as open-ended. So that falls under the same category as amending the compensation amount. It is a brokerage's decision. They should reach out to their brokerage's attorney and set a brokerage policy moving forward, whether or not they want to include a provision like that.
So the follow-up question then is, when you say open-ended, if there was language that said the buyer is willing to pay X% and up to language, that needs to be approved or not, or that's not allowed up to a certain amount.
So yes, I can tell you the settlement agreement says it cannot be open-ended. So that could be viewed as being open-ended. And that decision needs to be made by your broker.
Okay, thank you.
Mercedes? Oh,
Anita Castell has a question. Anita, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Taylor. Just making notes through your presentation and just wanted to touch on them. First one was you had talked about if it's not closing by the 14th, you would need the addendum. I know that the actual date is the 17th, which is a Saturday. I was just wondering if you're closing by Friday the 16th, would you still need the addendum?
So you're correct. The settlement agreement states that the changes need to go into or have to go into effect, and they will be enforced come August 17th. So yes, the deadline technically is August 17th. However, our strong recommendation is August 14th. It should be the day that everybody should assume August 14th is the day that you need to comply with all these changes, mainly because August 14th is the day that offers of cooperative compensation are being removed from the MLS. So yes, technically August 17th is the deadline. Very strongly recommended August 14th. You should treat August 14th as the deadline.
Thank you. And then one thing I just wanted to note, because I know you were talking about the way the compensation is laid out now. Just people need, I know agents need to remember that they can no longer consider the quote flat fee, admin fee, like they can charge the buyer that up over and above. That is part of the compensation, right? Because it's listed as, say, blank percent and blank flat fee, correct?
Right, that's included in the total amount of compensation.
Right, so they can't go there. And then I know you had talked about the whom agents represent instead of a buyer agency, but only if you're going to represent the seller.
Correct. I mean, it's the same
Yeah.
sub-agency rules as it is today.
Okay. And then, so the final thing is about that form, this form that's up right now, the listing broker offer. So the listing agent or broker is the one that's initializing this, and then the buyer broker can ask to amend it to a different amount, or is it starting with the buyer broker requesting?
So that's kind of how I was saying in practice, the way this form is shared might change. In my opinion, I think it makes the most sense because a buyer broker can only accept the maximum amount of compensation in their brokerage agreement. It would make the most sense for a buyer broker to fill out whatever that amount is and submit this to the listing broker to have them sign off on that amount.
And that's allowable because the buyer is signing off on it also.
Right. I mean,
Okay.
It's in the buyer's best interest, obviously, if the amount of cooperative compensation equals the amount of compensation they've agreed to compensate their broker, because then they're not going to have to pay anything.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain paragraph 6 of that addendum listing broker offer, paragraph 7? Okay, yes. So in the event of a conflict relating to cooperative compensation between a contract of sale and this offer of cooperative compensation, this offer of cooperative compensation shall control. So that's really referencing one specific line. There's only one specific area in our contract of sale or any addendum to the contract of sale that's addressing. And it is addressing the new addendum. It's addressing specifically this paragraph. So this is the paragraph, remember, where the brokers state, or the buyer and their agent is stating what the current agreement for broker-to-broker compensation is. So if this states X% here, but the actual agreement here between the brokers is a different percent, is Y%, this agreement controls. In other words, if the parties put an inaccurate amount in here, that is not what controls. It's whatever the brokers agreed to in here is what controls. And, you know, presumably it's going to be identified, oh, okay, you know, this doesn't match what the brokers agreed to here, so we need to amend this amount. If a property is listed, what needs to be done? New exclusive right or addendums? Karen, could you expand upon that a little more?
I'm sorry, if a property it's listed but not sold, you know, what changes need to be done to make us in compliance? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So you need to have your clients sign the amendment. It would be the amendment to the listing agreement. And if they sign that, then come August 14th, your current brokerage agreement will be amended to be compliant with the settlement agreement. Also, also a thing to note. So NAR has stated that if the parties go under contract before August 14th, because that's the day that offers of cooperative compensation are coming down from the MLS. If the parties go under contract before the 14th, and then after the 14th, it leads to a successful closing, the buyer broker can rely on whatever the offer of cooperative compensation was on the MLS prior to August 14th. They should be able to rely on that amount, and the listing broker will be bound to pay whatever that amount was. However, with that being said, the recommended practice would be, okay, I'm representing a buyer on August 7th. I see the offer of cooperative compensation on the MLS is X%. August 14th, that comes down from the MLS. What I should do is I should reach out to that listing broker and formalize that agreement for X% with this form. So you have it in writing between the brokers. If the parties do not go under contract before the 14th, and my buyer is interested in the property, then you have to get this agreement signed if you want to have, you know, a formalized agreement and commitment for an offer of cooperative compensation.
Hey, Taylor, Karen Gilbert Smith has had her hand up for a while. Karen, do you
Okay.
want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. I have a couple. I'm sorry. This has been very informative, by the way. Thank you, Taylor. Where's this amendment to the listing agreement you're referring to that will need to get signed?
So that is currently on our website, mdrealtors.org. Sorry,
Okay, you did not show that here, correct?
I did not. So I just
Okay,
showed.
I thought I maybe missed something.
No.
If you could pull up the oh, which form was it? Oh, I thought I wrote it. Hold on. Okay. I think it's the buyer's request for seller compensation. I think it was that one. Is that? Oh, goodness. Okay, number 7. Nope. Okay, that was answered. See, I'm sorry. I had such a list of questions here. Okay, back to the, I guess it was the buyer or seller agreement, where you said that you still have to submit the listing to the MLS, even if they don't want it distributed on the MLS. I was very confused on that form altogether. And the optional being the optional part of something else that you said, that whole part,
Yeah.
every part of that confused me. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So, and remember, these are Bright's rules. So this is my understanding of them. If anybody has questions moving forward about their rules, my recommendation would be to reach out to Bright. But if the client wants the property to be an office exclusive, Bright, that client's still required to submit the property to the MLS it's just going to be submitted as an office exclusive. It is
Understood. Yep.
It is not going to be distributed on the MLS. In other words, other people aren't going to be able to see it on the MLS.
Got it. It's like the office exclusive. That clears that up for me. I had another question, but I lost it. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, any other questions? I can't see raised hands.
There aren't any raised hands, but Robin Harris put one in the chat. If a property is already sold and scheduled to close after 8/17, what forms on the buyer and seller side need to be completed?
Is scheduled to close after the 17th. So I think the easiest way to think about it is if you are currently representing a client. In other words, if that transaction has not closed, you still represent the client. If you still represent a client come August, I'm going to say August 14th. Come August 14th, you need to make sure that they have signed the amendment to the corresponding brokerage agreement. So if your transaction closes before the 14th, great, you don't have to do anything. But if you're still representing that client and that transaction's not finished, come the 14th, you need to have them sign the amendment.
And also get the seller's broker to sign the compensation documents where they've agreed to a certain amount. So I'm trying to get the names of all the forms that need to be done because I have this is my real life situation. I have one under contract. It'll close on the 30th. And I need to make sure everything's in place before the 14th.
Right.
So I'm just trying to understand the names of the documents I need to focus on.
Yeah, so I'll go through what you actually need. So if you are still representing a client after the 14th, or even if you plan on it, you need to have them sign the right amendment. So we have an amendment for the buyer brokerage agreement. So if you're representing the buyer, have them sign that. And we have an amendment for our listing agreements. So if you represent a seller, have them sign that. Now this isn't technically required, but kind of going back to what I was talking about offers of cooperative compensation, if your client goes under contract before the 14th, then NAR has stated that listing broker is bound to pay that amount of cooperative compensation to the buyer broker, even if the transaction closes after the 14th. However, the recommended practice is to, on the 14th or after, send the listing broker's offer of cooperative compensation to the listing broker so you can put that agreement in writing, just to, protect yourself even more. So really the only required form, if you're going to represent a client after the 14th, a current client after the 14th, is get them to sign the amendment. If you sign a brand new client after the 14th, then we are, our form vendors, we're going to get them the new forms. They're going to replace the old brokerage agreements with the new ones. So you just, choose the brokerage agreement and it'll be compliant on the 14th or after.
And what if the listing broker doesn't have this knowledge or agree and thinks, that they don't need to do anything? Do I need to be concerned about their listing agreement being updated in order for the sale to be completed or not?
So I think I lost you. I think I lost you at the end there. So you were saying if you reach out on the 4th, let's say your client's under contract before the 14th rolls around and you reach out and say, can we put this agreement into writing here? And the listing broker says no.
Right. Or the listing broker is just not aware because their brokerage isn't up to speed on the changes that are happening at the, at Maryland Realtors for the forms. So they just don't have knowledge. So should we be concerned if the listing broker does not get their listing agreement signed and do their forms that they need on their side? Should the buyer side be concerned with that to close the deal?
Well, The listing broker updating their agreement, that does not affect the buyer broker in that situation. NAR has stated that listing broker is bound to pay the offer of cooperative compensation that was previously posted on the MLS after the 14th. So if I was in that situation on the buyer side, I would explain that to the listing broker. But at the end of the day, if they say, no, I'm not signing this agreement, and no, I'm not going to pay you that compensation, then like any dispute over commissions, the buyer broker would have a right to request arbitration through us at Maryland Realtors. And it would be, present their evidence. This was what the listing stated on the MLS before the 14th. We won under contract. Therefore, the listing broker has to pay me that amount. I do not expect this to be an issue. But if it is in the scenario that we just talked about, then if I'm on the list on the buyer broker side, request arbitration so you can, try to ensure that you get that commission. Any other questions?
It doesn't look like it.
Okay. Yes, good point, Karen. A good practice is if your transaction's not settling before August 14th, print out the MLS listing so you have proof that before the 14th, this is what the offer of cooperative compensation was. Okay, no more. If we don't have any more questions, just some things. Really, the main thing to note is that webinar on the 1st August. Let me just double check. Yes, August 1st is next Thursday at 10 a.m. We will have that webinar, which I'm sure it's going to be very packed. It'll be myself and our CEO Chuck Caskey going over the form changes and answering questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Taylor. And we are going to send out the recording from this webinar today, shortly after we end. Again, so sorry for the technical difficulties. Also in that email will be the registration link for the webinar that Taylor just mentioned.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you so much, Taylor. Anita just raised her hand.
I just saw a question in the chat that might want to get answered quickly.
Can we create a Google form and then a link and put it into comments?
For compensation, so I believe that would be okay. However, you're right with the compensation. You're saying Google form, put that link in the agent remarks. Remember, not open remarks, the agent remarks, putting that link. I believe that would be okay, but I can't give you a firm answer. Reach out to Bright and have them confirm whether that's okay or not.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and let us know if you have any questions that we can answer for you. Thank you again, Taylor.
Of course, no problem. Everybody have a nice day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.